Welcome back. I'd like to introduce our next session with Dr. Keir Winesmith, who is speaking about libraries and artificial intelligence, the good, the bad and the ugly. Dr. Keir Winesmith is the head of digital at the National Gallery of Australia, adjunct professor at UNSW Art and Design, and co-convener of the bi-monthly Sydney Culture Data Salon. He has been working with museums, galleries, libraries, archives and universities on digital transformation initiatives and the development of new digital experiences for over 15 years. Keir was recently the Digital Collections Catalyst in Residence at the State Library of Queensland and just published The Digital Future of Museums with Dr. Suze Anderson. A quick reminder that questions for speakers can be submitted via the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the page. Welcome, Dr. Keir Winesmith.
Thanks very much, Monica. And hi, everyone. I can't see you, so I'm just going to assume that you're enjoying what I'm saying. I'm coming to you from beautiful Ngambri Ngunnawal country. This is an old shot before the gallery was built, before the library was built, before they graced the shores of the lake. But I'm from Darug and Gadigal country, and it's there that I learned to swim in the Bardu and learned to climb the Boulia. But this is actually a project about Mianjin up in Brisbane in Queensland, as much as it is about a number of other things and the connections of place to technology and to the future. So I actually wrote this talk last year and a little bit earlier this year, called it Libraries and Artificial Intelligence, the Good, the Bad and the Ugly. And I showed it to a friend of mine recently, and something I've been really trying to be really mindful of is, I guess, a behavior of white men, let's say, a behavior of white men to assume they know everything. And so I wanted to give this talk to a friend, and I gave it to them and asked for critical feedback. And they said to me that actually it felt like I was punching down. Like if you look at libraries and artificial intelligence, you'll see a bit of this, which is hilarious and not actually that informative when it comes to artificial intelligence. You see a lot of this, which again is hilarious as an image goes, but not really that informative when it comes to artificial intelligence. You might see some of this, robots reading books, because that's exactly what you should build a robot to do, to look exactly like a human and read a book like a human reads, or maybe an animation of the same idea, a little bit of that. Libraries, artificial intelligence. Sometimes you see something clever, something good. This is out of Stanford, who I've done some work with, and they've done some really impressive work, and so is DX Lab in Sydney at the State Library of New South Wales. But when I started looking at doing a talk that was actually quite humorous about libraries and artificial intelligence, it did feel like I was mocking a field that was growing and building momentum. And libraries have been around a long time, and artificial intelligence has been around a short time, and their intersection is really interesting. And the advice I was given was not to try and sound cool and not to make fun of institutions or organizations that are really just getting started. Maybe not fun of is correct, but to describe as bad and ugly, it does that in a way. So I've redone the talk, and I'm actually do it in a really positive way, in a proactive way, in a hopefully a future focused way. And so I'm going to talk about a project that I did at the State Library of Queensland as their inaugural digital collection catalyst in residence for 2020. Because I think, and I hope that this project shows a little bit of what could be good and where the bad and ugly are to avoid, and where there are mistakes, they are my mistakes, and it's not me pointing out others' missteps. So hopefully it's a more positive and proactive way to think about this future together. So interest and precedents. I was lucky enough to be selected to be this collections catalyst in residence, and I'm fascinated by maps. I'm fascinated by maps, by collections, by the roles that maps and topographies take and place in our sense of self, in our sense of the future. And I'm fascinated by the role that technology can have in interpreting that and making that kind of weird and strange. So I'm interested in maps. There's an amazing array of maps in the Queensland collection. Amazing array of maps from all over the country, but in particular, Queensland, in particular, Southeast Queensland, from like the settlement of the colony, the kind of violent settlement of the colony through to the present, obviously with a kind of skew towards early colonial history, but all the way up into the present. And they are like stunningly beautiful objects. And I started thinking about ways of categorizing what it is and isn't to be Brisbane. I actually used this early map from 1957 to create the confines for Brisbane that I was going to use. So basically where the trams went in the 50s, where they stopped was sort of the end of my program area, my area of research. I looked at new maps, ones that had been digitized, ones that hadn't, and explored them to try and imagine what I could do with those maps to create a sense of what Brisbane might be in, say, 2030 or 2050, or when. What is the future that I wanted to explore? I was really interested in artificial intelligence, in particular how machine learning as a variant within AI could be used to predict the future. There are some interesting precursor projects like this one out of the UK, working with a group in the US, looking at the gentrification that could be generated or predicted using AI. A fantastic set of projects around how machine learning could be used to identify trees in San Francisco, where I used to live. And then working with really clever companies. So I actually met the team from Giraffe and their project. Our collaboration will show up in a few minutes. Also worked with Stamen in the past about how they can use maps. And actually this is a kind of design company whose maps end up showing up in the original pitch deck for Uber. So the way we use maps can have an influence on the way we navigate the world. This is also from UNSW and using a way of creating public services and retail strategies based on machine learning. So Brisbane is a city that isn't scared about imagining its future. It's been imagining its future for a long time. There's an all manner of different documents about the future of Brisbane. There's its blueprint and a whole bunch of other documents that look at how Brisbane could and couldn't be. And I wanted to intersect with those. So I went up, thought of how to possibly create something that was meaningful about the future of Brisbane based on the maps of the past. And the first thing that I did, and I think this actually ties closely to the set of strategies that I'm going to hopefully articulate for you to really lean on, the first thing I did was to ask, what do the people of Brisbane actually want from their future beyond the things that I've already seen? So I asked them, what's the first thing you recommend to people who are coming to Brisbane? What should we prioritize out of things that came out of some of those documents that already existed? Should we prioritize housing or public transport, green space, roads, or entertainment, cultural, and food districts? And if the building heights were maintained and density or growing green space, what of those two things would be more important? And then what is your narrative future for Brisbane? And I used asking Brisbane people as the kind of foundation for the project. Then I spoke to a bunch of people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, spoke to artists, makers, thinkers, creatives, writers, academics, bartenders, baristas, hotel staff, restaurant staff, as well as staff from State Library of Queensland, Brisbane Open House, the Cross River Rail Authority, got to meet the government architect and members of all of these organizations who are focused on creating this future. So I wanted anything I did using AI and the library's collection to be informed by the people who are already thinking about it, rather than me trying to come in and tell them what it had to be. Then of course, I went and looked at heaps and heaps of maps, like maybe 2,000 or 3,000 maps. And you can tell that I'm in a library working with an archive because I've got my gloves on and I'm looking really intently. This is me being an archivist, and it is absolutely enjoyable. So looking at these incredible maps, joining them up, and if you're interested in kind of following along at home, have a look at this website. If you just search Mapping Future Brisbane, you can't help but find it. The thing that I really noticed early on was that I could only see some of the maps in person, and I want to see them in aggregate. So I created a kind of index of all of the maps of Brisbane that any archive in the country owned. I used Trove, State Library of Queensland, State Library of New South Wales, a whole bunch of others. And then I mapped them like this to show where the patterns were for myself. And what it turns out is there's a big wave of change in the 1880s, which is around where the city kind of changed its settlement patterns entirely, started rolling out things like horse-drawn carriage, the train arrived, electricity arrived, sanitation arrived, massive growth in the city, and therefore a massive growth in the mapping. Then in the 1970s and into the 80s with the Expo, another massive growth in the city in terms of urban renewal in this case, but also a massive growth in mapping. And now I think we're in a third wave of Brisbane's mapping and a third wave of Brisbane's redefining itself. So these maps of the past were starting to inform the patterns of the future and of the present. And so this is just a screenshot from Cross City Rail, which shows you all of the kind of changes that are starting to happen, but there's many, many more beyond this. And I got to fly around inside the future map of Brisbane that the Cross City Rail team had developed. I took all these beautiful old maps and then normalized around the river. The thing we know about Brisbane is this iconic river. And so I trained a machine learning algorithm, a style GAN algorithm, to basically generate infinite maps of Brisbane based on the river at its center. And so I used this as a way to think about what are the topographies of Brisbane? If Brisbane's not going to change topography, what are the ways that it could be laid out differently, but we respect the elements of it that already exist? So I generated this series of objects, both the model, which went into the State Library's collection, all these images that went into the State Library's collection, and the strategies that went into the collection itself. I fell in love with this process and I really enjoyed it. So I kind of like threw myself into it, let's say. And then I found out that there's actually an incredible set of collections around around inside State Library, but also beyond other museums and institutions within the state government. And so I found this fantastic set of incremental drawings of the whole of Queensland over a period of years. And so I stripped them all out using a image magic tool to strip out all the centers of these. And then I trained another machine learning algorithm. So I've got one that creates infinite Brisbanes, and then I wanted to create one that created infinite Queenslands. And so I used, because with machine learning, it's always easier to use an existing model. So I took a model, an illustration model that had been used to do drawings of birds, and I'd retrained that to do drawings instead of birds, to make it do drawings of Brisbane topographies, sorry, of Queensland topographies, of Queensland maps. And again, over a series of steps, in this case, it was something like 3,000 or 4,000 steps. I trained it to learn how to generate, again, infinite maps of Queensland, allowed it to kind of move and morph in this thing that's called a latent spacewalk, which kind of walks you between. One thing that I really thought about during this process and was really guided by when speaking to a number of Indigenous folk and artists who were working and living or had lived in Brisbane was Brisbane's maps, just like all of the maps in the frontier lands of Australia, were generated by the colonists. They were the reflection of land stolen and never given willingly. They were markers of the margins of the territory of the colony as more and more land was stolen and co-opted and turned into what is now Australia, or what is now, you know, each of these states. And I was sort of advised to do something abstract and not something that was very concrete about the future of the city, because we would simply embed the kind of colonial behaviors of the past into the projection of the future, which is something I really wanted to avoid. So I did something that was actually more painterly, more abstract on the back of these models, so as to try to avoid doing more damage, I guess. And then I embedded them back into this sort of map infrastructure themselves. So this is like, imagine Russell Island, except it's generated by a machine, and it's a machine that didn't realize that you can't have roads in the water. So there's now roads kind of navigating through the water landscape here. And here's one of Brisbane, remaking Brisbane. So, but back to that project, because the project was about mapping future Brisbane, and this is sort of mapping impossible Brisbane based on the maps that are in the State Library's collection. So how do we map future Brisbane? And so again, we don't want to do more violence. We don't want to make the same mistakes of the past. We don't want to perpetuate into the future. Almost all of the examples I found of bad use of artificial intelligence is where we had encoded difficult, problematic, or violent and inappropriate histories into machines that recreated those histories. You know, if art history, as the Google, what was it called? Google Lab created this incredible thing where you could take a photo of yourself and then find yourself in art history. But because art history, let's face it, especially public domain art history, it's kind of, well, racist, then unless you're a white person like me, your representation in art history may not be flattering, and you may not even find yourself if you weren't part of, you know, that historic canon. And so I didn't want to recreate that, and I want to avoid that. And I think that's something we need to take really seriously when we think about how to apply these very easy to use tools. It is very easy to do what I just did. You know, I did it over a period of hours, some of these things, from the idea to the delivery. And so just because they're easy to do, just because the tools are available, doesn't mean we should do them. We should do them really thoughtfully. We should only use them in the right way. And so being guided by people, what they wanted to do was have a map of Brisbane they could play with to create their own version, their own future, their own vision for the city. So I wasn't sure how to make them a map of Brisbane. So two things I needed was a sense of where it was going population-wise, and a tool that was manipulable, because I didn't want to build a mapping system from scratch. And so I took all of the population density outputs from the Australian Bureau of Statistics over the last 25 years and made some changes based on the interviews that I'd conducted, on where new rail stations were going to open, where new developments were planned, where infrastructure was planned around education, especially higher education, but also where there were big parks that weren't going to get touched that couldn't possibly change. And then created this projected population density for 2036 based on the numbers that were leading up to 2021. And so counting out into the future about as far as I counted into the past. So this is not quite what the ABS has. It's like the Keir version of the ABS data based on this series of interviews. So I end up with this map of a replicable model of how population will change in Brisbane over time. And again, my Brisbane is the Brisbane limited to the areas, essentially the trams used to run in the 1950s. I appreciate that's arbitrary, but Brisbane is massive, biggest LGA in the Southern Hemisphere. And I want to focus on an area where there was this seismic change and where the maps that I had were reflected and could be connected. And so on the back of that, I worked with a company called Giraffe, a small, really sharp, super clever startup based in the eastern seaboard of Australia. They've got a few people in Sydney, but also a few people in Tassie. And they helped me, and I worked with them using their incredible technology stack to create this kind of interactive version of the city of Brisbane. So I'm going to tab over to that. And this is dangerous. You're always told never to do live demos in a talk. So let's see how we go. So the first thing you can do, and hopefully everyone can see this, is you can kind of navigate around Brisbane as it will be according to the model that I just described in 2036. So you'll see the areas that are very dense for Brisbane getting even denser, and the areas that are quite lightly touched staying light. What is interesting to me about Brisbane, so I'll zoom in a little bit, what's interesting to me about Brisbane, and maybe we can rotate, is that it has a very high density center, not much of a middle, and then this low outlying. It amazed me that I could walk within a couple of minutes from downtown to be in single family, single story dwellings, which is very different to many of the other cities in the country. It's also a city that in many ways, other than the river, is not fully set in people's minds. So it's a city that I think has a contested future, that its people and the people working on it, the urban designers and city planners, actually have a lot of influence in the future of Brisbane. Sydney's set, there's not a lot much you can do about that. Melbourne as well in many cases, but Brisbane has this malleable, exciting future, in my opinion. And so I think it's a really rich time to be having this sort of discussion. Then I created when I say I, the team at Giraffe, created this great little slider. So you can say, well, actually, I want something that's a bit more evenly distributed. I want a little bit more development out into the fringes to create this sort of middle. I want a kind of larger middle. Or actually, no, change my mind. I want it to be super, super dense in the city and only a tiny number of people out in. So I'd like a kind of balance. I think actually there's an opportunity to build up the areas around the city and have a city that actually is a bit higher density. That's what I'd like to live in. And then you can add your own green space. Let me just move this. So what you might want is like a really big new park. It's like half of the West End, let's say. Let's close that. And maybe you want another park. Maybe over here, you actually want a beautiful new park. The right button, sorry. Again, live demos, do not do them. Okay, you want a beautiful new park. Okay, maybe I'm gonna run out of time. Okay, so you want this beautiful new park in the West End, and what actually this algorithm does is it distributes these people that you've knocked out of that area, and it pushes them to live in essence elsewhere. So we keep the same population density, and the population gets distributed elsewhere across the city. So let's look at it maybe from this side. So nice, maybe from this side, let's look at that. And then you can save your map. And so you put in your name, that's my name, Keir Winesmith. I have my email address. I love this thing you made. And hopefully that will then generate a map based on what I just created, the things that I added, the orientations that I selected, and the distribution of people. So I can actually leave a mark. I can choose to generate and share the version of Brisbane that I'd like people to see. And what I try to do is then represent back to people the visual style of the maps that I'd found. So this is all kind of generated. It says who the designer and the year. I've added these kind of the commissioning agency, obviously the library, and put in little bits and vertical controls, and even created, let's see if we can zoom in, an office of the future past in the Department of Mapping and Speculating. So I even created like this cheesy little logo based on all the logos I could find of the past to allow people to like create their own and share their own. And it has been used by now hundreds of people, which is pretty cool. Something I'm really interested in is how you can democratize the tools back into the public's hands and imagination so they can create their own versions of their city, of their place, and grow their agency. You can play with it yourself. Again, if you search Mapping Future Brisbane, it's the first link, but mapping-future-brisbane, .web app is the interactive version of this. So the machine learning that I did with the historic collection got me to this abstract place. And from there, I parlayed into this more concrete space using that model to create the future, but then giving it to people for them to play with in the ways that they wanted to. Let me do not disturb until this evening. Last thing. So when I think about libraries and artificial intelligence, I really want to project to you, and something that I have absolutely learned, is that future is not set. There isn't a way that we need to do this or are expected to do this or have to do this. It is undefined. The tools are present, they are easy to use, they are available. Some of the things that I showed you today took an order of hours, like an afternoon. Other things like building an interactive map with all of the pieces are much harder, but those tools are becoming more and more democratic. So it's actually very much about how we use them, who we use them for, and how we include the people whose voices are excluded from the data that we are using to train and build our machine learning or other sorts of artificial intelligence, how we include them in our processes. And I'm sure Genevieve has covered this way more articulately than I could. So excited to share the bill with her today. And Marsha, amazingly, this is the place that we can excel, is by setting out a normal possible future for how artificial intelligence can be embedded into our practice, because no matter what it will be, it's up to us to do it in a way that centers those who have been decentered by the systems to this point. Otherwise, we will replicate the mistakes we've made in the past. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I sound a bit shouty. I'm incredibly passionate about this stuff and would love to chat to you if you want to know more. Cheers.
Thank you so much for your talk, Keir. I haven't seen a lot of questions come through. I think people are just really excited by the mapping technology. I was so interested to see the way that you've adopted artificial intelligence and what you described as very useful and easy to use tools to map infinite possibilities, infinite Brisbanes, infinite Queenslands as well. So it's that looking into the future, not just understanding the past. We do have one question that's come through here for you. Are there any plans to exhibit the maps made, either online or physically? Because it'd be interesting to see and compare the different Queenslands and different Brisbanes that people come up with.
Yeah, there is absolutely a plan to put them online. We did have a plan at the State Library, and I hope I'm not getting in trouble saying this because I know a few State Library colleagues, especially Anna and Rachel Merrick, who were instrumental in the success of the project. There is some plans to do something on site, but COVID has constrained our flexibility in that space. We were due to do a public launch and a big talk fest, but it's hard to gather people in a room. What I think is really beautiful about their approach to this whole project is, from the outset, they wanted to use it as an excuse to bring new things into the collection. There was one part of the project I didn't actually show. There was this set of amazing photos taken on this windmill tower, the old windmill tower in Brisbane on Spring Hill that looks out over the city. And there was photos taken just before and just after that wave of development I talked about in the 1880s, where it goes from almost like a mud flat with a few houses on it to something that really actually feels like a city. And so I went, actually stood up there and reshot that same set of photos, and on their website you've now got a comparison of like the 1850s and the 1890s and the 2020s. That the 2020 version has been added to their collection so that someone in maybe 2030 can do it again, and you can see that change in that comparison. But they took that approach to everything. So they've collected examples of the machine generated images, and they're collecting examples of the people who are making their own images, and they've also collected the models themselves into their collection so that people can then iterate on them if they want. And all of that will be available, not sure exactly when, but all of that will be available to the people of Queensland or the people of Australia. So I think that's actually exemplary personally, or I didn't drive this, they did. I think that's exemplary when it comes to how to do modern librarianship, let's say, digital librarianship. It's not just a final asset, it's the story that got you to the final asset that allows people to kind of test your work and build on it that is really critical to these sorts of projects.
Thank you so much for your time. And I think you're right. This is about creating modern digital librarianship, and it is about collections, building collections from the past, retelling a story, and building into the future. Please join me in thanking Dr. Keir Winesmith for joining us at Information Online. We're going to take a very quick break, and then we'll be back with our closing keynote speaker. And so I'll hand back our program chair, Vicky McDonald, when we return. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Monica.